No mother should ever have to choose between feeding her baby today and feeding herself tomorrow. The sharp electronic beep of the barcode scanner echoed beneath the harsh fluorescent lights as another customer rolled a cart toward the checkout lane, but Emily Carter barely noticed the sound anymore. Her attention stayed fixed on the single can of infant formula resting beside a loaf of whole wheat bread, a carton of eggs, a package of oatmeal, and a small bag of frozen vegetables. Her 8-month-old daughter, Lily, slept quietly against her chest in a faded gray baby carrier. Her tiny fingers curled around the edge of Emily's worn denim jacket as if the world outside didn't exist. Emily wished she could borrow even a fraction of that peaceful certainty. The cashier offered a tired but polite smile while scanning each item with practiced efficiency. Emily reached into her purse before the total even appeared, already knowing exactly how much money she had. Every dollar had been counted twice that morning at her tiny kitchen table beside an overdue electric bill and a handwritten grocery list that had slowly become shorter with every item she crossed off. She had skipped coffee. She had skipped lunch. She had promised herself she could make another pot of vegetable soup stretch for 2 more days. But baby formula was never something she believed she could compromise on. The register chimed one final time. Your total is $63.42. Emily swallowed as she counted a handful of folded bills, several quarters, and a few wrinkled $1 notes. $56. She checked every pocket anyway, hoping money might somehow appear through sheer desperation. Nothing. She looked down at Lily, whose soft breathing rose and fell against her heartbeat. Just yesterday, the pediatrician had reminded her not to water down formula, no matter how difficult things became. Babies needed proper nutrition. Emily already knew that. Mothers always knew. They simply didn't always know how to make impossible numbers work. I'm sorry, she whispered, her cheeks warming beneath the bright store lights. Could you remove the formula? The cashier hesitated for only a second. Her expression softened with understanding rather than judgment. Are you sure? Emily forced a smile that never reached her tired blue eyes. Yes, I'll come back after payday. The cashier slowly lifted the can from the conveyor belt. It made a dull metallic sound as it landed beside the register, louder than it should have been. Emily felt something inside her sink with it. Behind her, another shopping cart rolled closer. She could almost feel impatient eyes gathering around her, though no one actually spoke. She kept staring at the payment screen, pretending not to notice anyone else. Pride had become a luxury she could no longer afford, but dignity was something she still fought to keep. She gathered the remaining groceries into a reusable cloth bag with careful hands, already calculating how to make the food last until Friday. Maybe Lily could drink the last few ounces left in yesterday's container tonight. Maybe tomorrow she could call the community pantry again. Maybe someone had canceled a shift at the diner. Her life had quietly become a collection of maybes. Just as the cashier reached for the receipt, a calm voice broke through the silence behind her. Not today. Emily froze. The voice wasn't loud, but it carried a quiet confidence that somehow filled the entire checkout lane. She turned slowly. A tall man stood behind his cart wearing a navy quilted jacket over a simple button-down shirt. There was nothing flashy about him. His clothes fit well, but weren't designed to attract attention. A silver watch peeked from beneath his sleeve, scratched enough to suggest it had been worn for years rather than collected for appearances. His calm gray eyes met hers without a trace of pity. He wasn't looking at her the way people often looked at struggling single mothers. There was no sympathy wrapped in superiority, no curiosity, no judgment, only simple kindness. Before Emily could speak, he placed the can of formula back onto the conveyor belt and slid a black credit card toward the cashier. Please ring everything up again, he said gently. Emily immediately shook her head. No, I appreciate it, but I can't let you do that. The stranger smiled, not with triumph, but with quiet reassurance. You're not accepting charity, he replied. You're accepting one good day. Emily opened her mouth to protest again, but Lily stirred softly against her chest, letting out the smallest sleepy sigh. For the first time all afternoon, Emily's shoulders relaxed just enough to breathe. She had no idea that the man standing in front of her was Alexander Brooks, the billionaire founder of one of the largest healthcare companies in America. She only knew that on the day she believed she had run out of hope, a complete stranger had refused to let her walk away without the one thing her daughter needed most. Emily stood motionless as the receipt slowly printed from the register, its soft mechanical hum filling the silence between them. She had spent years teaching herself never to depend on strangers because experience had taught her that unexpected generosity usually arrived carrying invisible conditions. Yet this man simply waited, his attention drifting toward Lily, whose tiny hand had escaped the blanket and rested peacefully against her mother's jacket. The cashier placed the bagged groceries beside the fresh can of formula and smiled warmly. "Everything is taken care of." Emily looked at the stranger once more. "I cannot let you spend this much on someone you have never met." He gave a small shrug that seemed almost effortless. "You already would have done the same if our places were reversed." Emily almost laughed at the impossible idea. She could barely afford groceries. How could she ever help someone who clearly had far more than she did? Still, something about the certainty in his voice made her wonder if he truly believed it. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded receipt from another store. On the blank backside, she quickly wrote her name and phone number with a blue pen that occasionally skipped ink. "Please," she said, handing it to him. "Someday I will pay you back." He accepted the paper but never looked at it. Instead, he folded it once and slipped it into his jacket pocket without reading the number. "Then promise me something else instead." Emily frowned slightly. "What is that?" "When life becomes kinder to you, help someone who cannot repay you." The words settled gently into the air, carrying none of the weight of a lecture. They sounded more like a memory than advice. Emily nodded almost automatically. "I can promise that." His smile reached his eyes for the first time. "Then we are even." Before she could ask his name, another customer approached the checkout with a cart overflowing with weekend groceries. The stranger stepped aside to make room, offering Emily a courteous nod as though their brief conversation had been the most ordinary part of his afternoon. She lifted the grocery bag onto her shoulder, adjusted Lily carefully against her chest, and walked toward the automatic doors. Cold November air greeted her as she stepped into the parking lot. The wind carried the scent of approaching rain, and gray clouds stretched across the late afternoon sky. Emily paused beside her aging sedan, placing the groceries inside before securing Lily into her car seat. The little girl opened sleepy blue eyes for a moment, smiled without understanding anything that had happened, then drifted peacefully back to sleep. Emily rested one hand on the steering wheel without starting the engine. Tears quietly filled her eyes, not because someone had paid for groceries, but because for the first time in months another adult had looked at her without seeing a burden. She whispered a silent thank you that no one could hear. Across the parking lot, the stranger loaded only 2 small paper bags into the trunk of a dark gray SUV. He remained standing for a moment, watching Emily's car leave the lot before closing the trunk. His phone vibrated inside his pocket. The screen displayed more than a dozen missed calls followed by a message from his executive assistant. The board meeting had already been delayed twice. Investors from New York had arrived nearly 40 minutes earlier, waiting inside Brooks Healthcare headquarters less than 15 miles away. Another message appeared almost immediately. It read, "Everyone is asking where you are." Alexander glanced once toward the highway where Emily's old sedan disappeared into evening traffic. He typed only 4 words before placing the phone back into his pocket. "Running late. Family emergency." Technically, it was not true, yet somehow it felt closer to the truth than explaining he had spent 15 minutes inside a neighborhood grocery store because one exhausted mother should never have been forced to leave without baby formula. As he climbed behind the wheel, he noticed the folded piece of paper Emily had given him resting on the passenger seat where it had slipped from his jacket. He unfolded it for the first time. Emily Carter. Beneath her name was a carefully written phone number in neat handwriting. He smiled quietly before folding it again and placing it inside his wallet, not beside his business cards or credit cards, but inside the worn leather compartment where he kept the only photograph of his late mother, as though something about the encounter deserved to remain among the memories that mattered most. 3 mornings later, the soft buzz of Emily's aging alarm clock echoed through her small apartment before sunrise. She reached over quietly, silencing it before it could wake Lily, who was still sleeping peacefully in her crib beside the bed. Pale winter light filtered through the worn curtains, revealing the familiar cracks in the ceiling and the stack of unopened bills waiting on the kitchen counter. For a brief moment, Emily simply stood there watching her daughter sleep, feeling grateful that the formula she had almost left behind at the grocery store had carried them through the week without worry. That single act of kindness had bought her something even more valuable than food. It had bought her time. Today mattered. After dozens of unanswered applications and several disappointing interviews, she finally had another opportunity. Brooks Healthcare had invited her to interview for an administrative coordinator position. The salary was better than anything she had earned since Lily was born. It included health insurance, predictable hours, and childcare assistance after the probation period. Emily had read the email at least 20 times, afraid it might somehow disappear if she looked away. She carefully dressed in the only navy blazer she owned, pressing the sleeves one last time with a warm iron before slipping it on. The fabric was several years old, but she had taken good care of it. She wanted whoever interviewed her to notice her professionalism before they noticed her circumstances. After dropping Lily at a licensed childcare center recommended by her church, Emily drove across the city toward downtown. Glass towers reflected the morning sun, standing like silent reminders of lives completely different from her own. Brooks Healthcare headquarters rose above the surrounding buildings with clean lines of steel and glass, elegant without feeling extravagant. Employees streamed through the revolving doors carrying laptops and coffee cups, moving with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they belonged. Emily tightened her grip on the leather folder containing her resume and references before walking inside. The marble lobby felt almost impossibly quiet despite the steady movement of visitors. Fresh flowers stood near the reception desk, filling the air with a faint scent of white lilies. A receptionist greeted her with a welcoming smile. "Good morning. How may I help you?" "Emily Carter. I have a 10 o'clock interview with Human Resources." The receptionist checked the schedule and nodded. "Welcome, Ms. Carter. Someone will be with you shortly." Emily thanked her and took a seat near the windows. She reviewed her resume one final time, even though she already knew every line by heart. 3 years managing scheduling at a rehabilitation clinic. Strong organizational skills. Excellent performance reviews. Employment gap after Lily's birth. She wondered whether that final line would matter more than everything above it. Across the lobby, the private executive elevator opened with a soft chime. Several senior executives stepped aside as one man exited carrying nothing more than a leather portfolio. Conversations briefly paused before continuing again. Emily glanced up almost absent-mindedly, then froze. The familiar navy jacket had been replaced by a tailored charcoal suit, but the silver watch remained exactly the same, its worn leather strap unmistakable beneath the crisp white cuff. Her heartbeat quickened. It was him, the man from the grocery store. The stranger who had quietly placed baby formula back onto the conveyor belt and changed the course of her week with a single sentence. Before she could decide whether to wave or simply smile, several executives surrounded him, discussing financial reports, expansion plans, and upcoming meetings with the effortless rhythm of people accustomed to following his direction. One of them addressed him clearly enough for the entire lobby to hear. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks. The board is waiting upstairs." Emily felt every thought inside her mind stop at once. "Mr. Brooks. Brooks Healthcare." The realization settled slowly, almost too unbelievable to accept. The quiet stranger who had stood behind her at the grocery store was not simply another customer. He was Alexander Brooks, the founder and chief executive officer of the very company where she hoped to rebuild her life. For a brief second, Alexander looked toward the reception area. His calm gray eyes met hers with immediate recognition, but instead of surprise or awkwardness, his expression remained warm and composed. He offered nothing more than a small, respectful nod before continuing toward the executive elevators, as though protecting the privacy of the moment they had shared. Emily watched the elevator doors close, still unable to fully process what she had just learned. She had entered the building believing she was chasing a new beginning. She never imagined fate had quietly arrived several days earlier beneath the bright lights of a neighborhood grocery store. Emily remained seated for several seconds after the executive elevator doors closed, her resume resting forgotten in her lap. The image of Alexander Brooks standing quietly behind a grocery cart refused to match the confident leader every employee in the lobby seemed to recognize instantly. She had expected someone with his position to arrive surrounded by cameras or assistants carrying expensive briefcases. Instead, The man who had paid for her groceries had stood patiently in line wearing an ordinary jacket, speaking so gently that no one would have guessed he was responsible for thousands of employees. Ms. Carter, a pleasant voice interrupted her thoughts. Emily looked up to find a human resources manager extending a welcoming hand. I am Karen Mitchell. Thank you for coming in today. Emily stood quickly, smoothing the front of her blazer before shaking her hand. Thank you for inviting me. Karen led her through bright hallways lined with photographs of community health programs, employee volunteer events, and families smiling together. Emily noticed that the company walls displayed people rather than products. It felt surprisingly warm for a corporate headquarters. They entered a comfortable conference room overlooking the city skyline. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting across a polished wooden table where a notebook, a bottle of water, and a company folder had already been prepared. Karen smiled encouragingly. Please make yourself comfortable. We are looking forward to learning more about you. The interview began with familiar questions about scheduling experience, organization, communication, and handling stressful situations. Emily answered honestly, drawing from years spent coordinating appointments, solving last-minute problems, and helping patients who often arrived frightened or overwhelmed. As the conversation continued, her nervousness slowly faded. She was no longer thinking about impressive buildings or executive titles. She was simply talking about work she genuinely loved. Karen reviewed the final page of Emily's resume before looking up with gentle curiosity. I noticed there is a gap in your employment history. Would you be comfortable telling me about that? Emily took a quiet breath. She had rehearsed this answer many times. After my daughter was born, childcare became more expensive than my paycheck. I accepted evening shifts at a neighborhood diner while searching for a position where I could build a long-term career again. It was not the path I expected, but my daughter has always come first. Karen nodded thoughtfully without the slightest hint of judgment. Thank you for your honesty. A soft knock came from the conference room door. Karen glanced toward it. Come in. The door opened, and Emily felt her heartbeat skip once again. Alexander Brooks stepped inside carrying a thin folder. The room immediately seemed quieter, though nothing else had changed. Karen stood respectfully. Good morning, Mr. Brooks. Alexander offered her a warm smile before turning toward Emily with the same calm expression she remembered from the grocery store. I hope I am not interrupting. Not at all, Karen replied. We were just finishing. Alexander looked at Emily as though they were meeting for the first time in a professional setting. Ms. Carter, welcome to Brooks Healthcare. His voice remained steady and courteous, revealing nothing about the encounter they had shared days earlier. Emily stood. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. She carefully chose the formal greeting, understanding that whatever had happened at the grocery store belonged outside these office walls. Alexander glanced briefly at her resume. I like to personally meet candidates for positions that directly support our operations. Every role matters here. He pulled out a chair across from Emily and sat down without any ceremony. May I ask you one question? Emily nodded. Of course. He folded his hands on the table. Tell me about a time when doing the right thing was more difficult than doing the easy thing. Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she thought about the countless choices that never appeared on resumes. Working double shifts while smiling at customers. Skipping meals so Lily could eat well. Walking away from opportunities that required sacrificing time with her daughter. Finally, she spoke softly. Sometimes doing the right thing does not feel brave. Sometimes it simply feels necessary. You make the decision because someone else depends on you, even if nobody ever notices the sacrifice. The room fell completely silent. Alexander studied her for a long moment before a faint smile appeared. It was the same quiet smile she had seen beside the grocery checkout lane. How she behaved when she believed no one important was watching. Emily left the conference room carrying the same leather folder she had brought into the building, yet somehow it felt lighter in her hands. Karen Mitchell walked beside her through the quiet hallway, answering a few final questions about the hiring process before stopping near the reception area. We still have several candidates to meet this week, Karen explained with a friendly smile. You should hear from us within a few business days. Emily nodded politely. Thank you for your time. No matter what happens, I truly appreciate the opportunity. Karen extended her hand once more. Safe drive home, Ms. Carter. As Emily crossed the marble lobby toward the revolving doors, she replayed every answer she had given during the interview, wondering whether she had spoken too quickly or forgotten something important. She had learned long ago that hope could be dangerous when money was running out. Hope encouraged people to imagine futures that reality sometimes refused to deliver. Outside, a cool breeze swept through downtown, carrying golden leaves across the sidewalk. Emily climbed into her aging sedan and rested both hands on the steering wheel before starting the engine. She whispered a quiet prayer that whatever happened next would simply allow her to provide a stable life for Lily. Meanwhile, 40 floors above, Alexander Brooks stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office overlooking the city. His executive assistant, Michael Turner, entered carrying a tablet filled with interview evaluations. The human resources team was impressed, Michael said. Emily Carter scored near the top in every category. Alexander continued looking out at the skyline. Near the top, Michael glanced down at the report. One applicant scored slightly higher on software certifications. Alexander finally turned around. And on character? Michael hesitated for a moment before smiling. That category is not usually listed on interview reports. Alexander walked toward his desk, where Emily's resume rested beside several financial documents waiting for his signature. Perhaps it should be. Michael studied him curiously. You knew the candidate before today. It was not a question. Alexander gave a small nod. Briefly, Michael had worked beside Alexander for almost 12 years. He recognized the thoughtful expression that appeared whenever his employer was making an important decision. Should I notify Human Resources that she has your recommendation? Alexander answered immediately. No, Michael blinked with surprise. No. Alexander sat down, folding his hands calmly. If Emily Carter joins this company, it will be because she earned the position, not because I happened to meet her in a grocery store. Michael remained silent, waiting for him to continue. Kindness deserves respect, Alexander said quietly. It does not deserve favoritism. He picked up Emily's resume once more, reading the final page carefully. There was no attempt to gain sympathy. No dramatic explanations. Only honest work experience, professional references, and a straightforward employment history shaped by the responsibilities of raising a child alone. He admired that restraint more than any polished interview technique. Continue the process exactly as planned, Alexander instructed. Blind evaluations. Standard hiring procedures. I do not want anyone changing a single score because my name entered the conversation. Understood, Michael replied. And if another candidate finishes slightly ahead? Alexander smiled gently. Then we hire the better candidate. Michael nodded with quiet respect before leaving the office. Alone again, Alexander opened his wallet to retrieve a business card for his next meeting. Instead, the folded piece of paper with Emily's handwritten phone number slipped onto the desk. He unfolded it slowly. The ink remained slightly uneven where the pen had skipped across the paper. He remembered how determined she had looked while insisting she would repay a complete stranger someday. Most people who received unexpected help quickly forgot the moment once life improved. Emily had offered repayment before even learning his name. That simple gesture had revealed more about her than any interview ever could. At nearly the same moment, across the city, Emily arrived at the childcare center just before closing time. Lily squealed with delight the instant she saw her mother, stretching both tiny arms forward. Emily lifted her close, breathing in the familiar scent of baby shampoo and warm blankets. Did you have a good day, sweetheart? Lily answered with cheerful laughter that echoed through the room. Emily smiled despite the uncertainty still hanging over her future. Whatever happened with the interview, this little girl remained the reason she would keep getting back up after every disappointment. Neither mother nor daughter realized that the most important decision about Emily's future had not yet been made, because for the first time in many years, someone with the power to change her life had chosen not to open a door for her, but to leave it unlocked so she could walk through it by her own strength. 2 days passed with no phone call, and Emily refused to let anxiety steal the small moments that mattered most. Every morning began the same way. She packed Lily's diaper bag, kissed her tiny forehead, and worked double shifts at the neighborhood diner while checking her phone only during breaks. Every unfamiliar number made her heart race before disappointment quietly settled back in. Late Thursday afternoon, as she wiped down the last booth before the dinner rush, her phone vibrated again. She almost ignored it, assuming it was another bill collector. Instead, The screen displayed an unfamiliar downtown number. Emily stepped into the quiet hallway beside the kitchen before answering. "Hello, this is Emily Carter." "Good afternoon, Miss Carter. This is Karen Mitchell from Brooks Healthcare." Emily instinctively held her breath. "We would like to offer you the administrative coordinator position, pending your acceptance." For a moment, she could not find any words. The hallway, the voices from the kitchen, even the sound of dishes being stacked behind the swinging doors seemed to disappear. "Miss Carter?" Karen asked gently. Emily finally smiled, her eyes filling with grateful tears. Yes, I would be honored to accept." Karen explained the starting salary, benefits, orientation schedule, and health coverage. Every sentence sounded almost unreal. Predictable hours, paid vacation, medical insurance beginning after the introductory period. Emily thanked her repeatedly before ending the call. She leaned against the hallway wall, covering her mouth as quiet tears slipped down her cheeks. They were not tears of relief alone. They were the release of months spent carrying fear that never allowed her shoulders to fully relax. That evening, she picked up Lily from the childcare center with lighter steps than she had taken in years. On the drive home, she stopped at a small grocery store, not because they desperately needed food, but because for the first time she could buy fresh fruit without calculating whether it meant sacrificing something else later in the week. She placed apples, bananas, yogurt, and a fresh loaf of bread into her basket. When she reached the checkout, her eyes drifted toward the shelf where baby formula was displayed. She smiled quietly. This time she did not hesitate before placing a new container into her cart. As she reached for her wallet, she noticed an elderly woman several feet away speaking softly with another cashier. The woman searched through a small coin purse again and again before finally lowering her head with quiet embarrassment. "I am sorry," she whispered. "Please take the soup off." Emily recognized the expression immediately. It was the same mixture of dignity and disappointment she had seen in the mirror only days earlier. Without giving herself time to overthink the decision, she walked over and placed the can of soup back on the counter beside the woman's groceries. "Please ring it up," Emily said with a gentle smile as she handed over her debit card. The elderly woman looked startled. "Oh no, dear. I cannot ask you to do that." Emily smiled even more warmly. "You did not ask." The cashier completed the purchase while the older woman's eyes filled with grateful tears. "How can I ever repay you?" Emily remembered the calm voice from the grocery store several days before. "Someday," she answered softly, "when life is kind to you, help someone else." The woman nodded through her tears. "I promise." Emily left the store carrying Lily in one arm and the grocery bag in the other. She never noticed the security camera mounted above the entrance quietly recording the entire exchange. The following morning, inside Brooks Healthcare headquarters, Alexander Brooks reviewed routine reports with Michael Turner when an email from the company's community outreach department appeared on his screen. Attached was a short security video forwarded by the grocery store manager, who happened to serve on the board of one of Brooks Healthcare's charitable partnerships. Alexander clicked play. He watched silently as Emily stepped forward without hesitation, paying for a stranger's groceries only days after receiving help herself. When the video ended, neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Michael looked toward Alexander with a quiet smile. "She kept her promise." Alexander closed the laptop gently. "No," he replied. "She kept her character. The promise was only the proof." Emily's first Monday at Brooks Healthcare began before sunrise. She arrived nearly 40 minutes early, unwilling to risk being remembered as the new employee who walked in late. The lobby looked different now that she entered as part of the company instead of a visitor. Employees greeted one another by name. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted from a small cafe near the entrance, and morning sunlight reflected across the polished marble floor. She adjusted the simple silver necklace her late grandmother had given her, took one quiet breath, and walked toward the Human Resources office. Orientation passed quickly. New identification badge, computer login, benefits paperwork, emergency contacts. Emily listened carefully to every instruction, writing neat notes inside a small spiral notebook she had purchased the night before. She wanted to earn every opportunity this position offered. By lunchtime, Karen Mitchell introduced her to the operations department, where Emily would coordinate executive schedules, organize project timelines, and communicate with multiple departments throughout the building. The work was demanding, but it felt familiar. Every completed task restored a little more of the confidence motherhood had forced her to set aside while survival consumed her days. During the afternoon, her supervisor handed her a thick folder. These reports need to be delivered to the executive floor before 3 o'clock. Emily accepted the assignment with a grateful smile. I will take care of it. The executive floor felt noticeably quieter than the rest of the building. Large windows overlooked the city, and every office reflected careful simplicity rather than unnecessary luxury. Emily delivered the reports one by one until only a single folder remained. Brooks, Alexander. She paused outside the office door for just a second before knocking gently. Come in, his familiar voice answered. Emily stepped inside, carrying the folder close to her chest. Alexander looked up from several documents spread across his desk. His expression remained professional, yet the same quiet warmth still lived in his gray eyes. Good afternoon, Miss Carter. Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks. She placed the folder neatly on his desk. Your quarterly reports. Thank you. He glanced toward the folder, but did not immediately open it. How has your first day been? Emily smiled politely. Busy, which I think is a good sign. Usually it is. A brief silence settled between them before Emily finally spoke the question she had carried since her interview. May I ask you something? Alexander nodded. Of course. At the grocery store. Why did you help me? He leaned back slightly, considering the question. Because you needed help. Emily shook her head gently. Most people would have looked away. Alexander's gaze drifted toward the window where autumn sunlight shimmered across neighboring buildings. My mother used to tell me that kindness only matters when it costs you something. Emily listened quietly. When I was 12 years old, he continued, she forgot her wallet while shopping. She was embarrassed, ready to leave without buying anything. Before she could apologize, another customer quietly paid for her groceries and walked away without giving his name. Emily smiled softly. Did she ever find him? Alexander returned her smile. No. She spent the rest of her life hoping she would. He folded his hands together. Instead, she decided the only way to thank him was to become the kind of person who would do the same for someone else. Emily lowered her eyes thoughtfully. And now you are doing the same. I am trying. Another quiet pause filled the office, comfortable rather than awkward. Before Emily turned to leave, Alexander noticed something through the glass wall behind her. Michael Turner was approaching with hurried steps, his expression unusually serious. A moment later, there was a respectful knock at the open door. I am sorry to interrupt, Michael said. Mr. Brooks, your mother has arrived unexpectedly. Alexander looked surprised. She did not mention she was coming today. She said it was personal. Emily immediately stepped back toward the door. I should let you get back to your afternoon. Alexander nodded appreciatively. Thank you again for delivering the reports, Miss Carter. Emily smiled once before leaving the office. As the elevator doors closed behind her, she had no idea that the woman who had just arrived upstairs carried a faded photograph inside her purse. A photograph taken nearly 20 years earlier at a rainy bus stop, featuring a frightened young college student and an exhausted stranger whose life had been quietly changed by a simple act of unexpected kindness. Upstairs, the private sitting room beside Alexander's office felt more like a quiet library than part of a corporate headquarters. Margaret Brooks stood near the window with a warm cup of tea in her hands, watching the city below. At 68, her silver hair framed a face marked less by age than by kindness. She smiled as Alexander entered. You look tired, she said gently. That usually means you have been carrying everyone else's problems again. Alexander laughed softly before embracing her. I could say the same about you. They sat together near the window, speaking for several minutes about family, community projects, and the upcoming holiday season. Eventually, Margaret reached into her handbag and removed a small, weathered envelope. I found something while cleaning the attic last week. She handed it across the table. Alexander carefully opened it and discovered an old photograph with faded edges. Rain covered the background like tiny silver threads. A much younger Margaret stood beside a city bus stop wearing a simple blue coat, smiling beside a teenage girl with light blonde hair pulled into a loose ponytail. The girl could not have been older than 16. She wore a grocery store uniform and held 2 steaming paper cups of coffee. Alexander studied the picture with curiosity. Who took this? A bus driver, Margaret answered with a nostalgic smile. He thought it was sweet that a stranger had insisted on sharing her coffee with me while we waited for the rain to stop. Alexander looked more closely at the young girl's face. Something about her features felt strangely familiar, though he could not immediately explain why. Margaret continued quietly. You were away at a school science competition that weekend. I had just finished a double nursing shift. My car broke down across town, my wallet was missing, and I had not eaten since breakfast. I remember feeling completely invisible. She gently touched the photograph. Then this young cashier came running across the parking lot carrying 2 coffees and half of her sandwich. Alexander listened without interrupting. He had heard pieces of this story before, but never in such detail. She told me that everyone deserved one warm meal on a cold day, Margaret said. I tried to give her money later, but she refused. She said she had packed lunch from home and could always make another sandwich tomorrow. Margaret smiled through distant memories. I never even learned her last name. Alexander lowered his eyes toward the photograph once more. His attention settled on the girl's silver necklace, barely visible beneath the collar of her uniform. A tiny heart-shaped pendant reflected the camera flash. His expression changed almost instantly. He had seen that necklace before, just hours earlier, around Emily Carter's neck. Mom, he said slowly, are you certain this photograph was taken about 20 years ago? Margaret nodded. Very certain. What? Alexander stood and walked toward the window, trying to organize the sudden flood of thoughts racing through his mind. Emily had mentioned her grandmother, the necklace, the grocery store, the instinctive kindness that appeared so natural it almost seemed inherited. None of it felt like coincidence anymore. Do you remember her first name? Margaret closed her eyes, searching through memories softened by time. Emily, she whispered after several seconds. I remember because I wrote her name inside my prayer journal that night. I wanted to remember the girl who reminded me that goodness still existed. Alexander slowly turned back toward his mother. Her name is Emily Carter. Margaret looked at him with quiet surprise. You know her? Alexander smiled in disbelief. She started working here this morning. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence carried no confusion, only quiet wonder. Margaret looked down at the faded photograph resting between them and gently brushed away an invisible speck of dust from its corner. All these years, she whispered, I prayed that life would be kind to that young girl. Alexander thought back to the grocery store checkout lane, to the can of baby formula, to Emily paying for an elderly woman's soup only days after receiving help herself. A quiet realization settled over him with unmistakable clarity. He had believed he was helping a struggling mother because it was the right thing to do. The truth was far deeper. Long before Emily Carter had ever stood in that grocery store, she had already given something precious to his family without expecting anything in return. Kindness had not begun with him. It had simply found its way home. The following morning, Emily was organizing project files when Karen Mitchell appeared beside her desk with a warm smile. Mr. Brooks would like to see you when you have a moment. Emily nodded, wondering whether she had made an unnoticed mistake during her first week. She carefully straightened the stack of folders in front of her before taking the elevator to the executive floor. When she knocked gently on Alexander's office door, his familiar voice invited her inside. This time, however, he was not alone. Margaret Brooks stood beside the window, holding the faded photograph in both hands. The moment Emily stepped into the room, Margaret's eyes rested on the small silver heart-shaped necklace around her neck. Tears immediately filled the older woman's eyes. You still wear it, she whispered. Emily instinctively touched the pendant. It belonged to my grandmother, she answered softly. She gave it to me before she passed away. Margaret slowly walked closer until only a few feet separated them. She carefully held out the weathered photograph. Do you remember this day? Emily accepted the picture with puzzled curiosity. She studied the faded image, then smiled with quiet surprise. I remember the rain. Her eyes moved to the woman standing beside her younger self. The memory returned slowly, like sunlight breaking through morning fog. You missed your bus? Emily said gently. You looked so tired. Margaret nodded as tears slipped down her cheeks. You gave me your lunch. Emily laughed softly, almost embarrassed. It was only half of a sandwich and 2 coffees. To you, Margaret replied, it was lunch. To me, it was hope. Emily looked down at the photograph again, suddenly realizing why Alexander had seemed strangely familiar from the beginning. She glanced toward him with quiet astonishment. You knew? Alexander smiled gently. Not until yesterday. He stepped closer, his hands resting comfortably in his pockets. For years my mother told me about the young girl who reminded her that kindness still existed. She never knew where life had taken you. Emily shook her head in disbelief. I had completely forgotten about that day. Margaret reached for Emily's hand. That is because truly kind people rarely keep score. The room fell silent, filled only by the distant sound of city traffic beyond the windows. After a moment, Alexander walked toward a display shelf beside his desk. Resting there, inside a simple glass case, was an unopened can of infant formula. Emily recognized it instantly. You kept it? She asked quietly. Alexander nodded. Not because of what it cost. His eyes met hers. Because it reminds me that success means very little if you walk past someone who needs compassion. Emily smiled through grateful tears. I thought you changed my life. That day, Alexander shook his head. No, you changed ours long before we ever met again. Several months later, Emily had become one of the most respected coordinators at Brooks Healthcare. Her calm leadership, steady work ethic, and genuine care for others earned admiration throughout the company. Every Friday afternoon, she volunteered with the Brooks Community Family Fund, helping parents facing the same impossible choices she once knew so well. Alexander never announced donations made through the foundation, and Emily never shared the story of the grocery store with anyone outside the Brooks family. They both understood that kindness loses something precious the moment it seeks applause. On a quiet spring afternoon, Emily carried Lily through the entrance of a neighborhood grocery store. Near the checkout, she noticed a young father quietly removing diapers from his shopping cart after realizing he could not afford everything. Before he could apologize, Emily gently placed the package back on the conveyor belt and handed her card to the cashier. The young father looked at her with grateful disbelief. How can I ever thank you? Emily smiled, hearing familiar words echo through her heart. When life becomes kinder to you, she said softly, help someone who cannot repay you. As she walked toward the parking lot with Lily resting happily on her shoulder, the afternoon sunlight warmed the sidewalk ahead. Some people believe the world changes because of extraordinary moments. But more often, it changes because one ordinary person quietly refuses to let another lose hope. And sometimes the greatest gift we leave behind is not the help we receive, but the kindness we choose to pass on.